Welcome, everyone. So glad you all could join us for the Catalyst to Adoption session. I want to first thank our sponsors. I don't know where that went. I guess we lost the sponsors. Oh, there we go. Want to thank our sponsors for making this possible. So to kind of kick things off, I wanted to do a few framing remarks. So in the defense world, we oftentimes talk about revolutions in military affairs, those fundamental changes that drive how wars are fought, how wars are won. And when we think about revolutions in military affairs, we oftentimes think about technology, things like carrier warfare, or the advent of the nuclear age, or even the use of the longbow during the Battle of Crécy in the 100 Years' War. But the thing is, a revolution in military affairs, it's not just about the technology, it's about the organizational and operational innovation around it. So what makes this panel unique, and why I'm really excited about the 4 speakers we have, although the final speaker is coming in hot from the airport, so we'll see if he makes it in time, is they're going to be focused on those latter 2 things: organizational innovation, operational innovation. So what are the processes we can put in place to drive technology into DoD, to drive structural change within the government and defense? So with that, I am going to introduce our first speaker, Tim Hill. He's a retired naval flight officer and acquisition professional whose last tour of duty was as commanding officer of NOC TSD. He's been with Intuitive Research and Technology for just over 3 years. As a co-founder of the Central Florida Tech Grove, he's especially passionate about harnessing innovation to maintain U.S. and allied combat advantage. So welcome, Tim.
Cool.
Oh, and sorry, one more thing. Scan this QR code right now, and that's how you're going to submit questions. So I'm going to give everyone 10 seconds. Scan this QR code. That's how we'll be submitting questions.
Sweet, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, before I'll give you a second to get that before I start flipping stuff. But good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for showing up. I know we're the only thing standing between you and a cold drink, so we'll stay on time. So you know, as Jenny mentioned, and thanks for that intro, by the way, and I do want to also make sure you understand, stay and join us for a toast to the upcoming Navy victory over Army after this. Preemptive shots fired for Bob there. That's a thing for those of you that have seen the history. We do that a little bit. Now, so I'm really passionate about innovation, and there's a reason for that. But before I get into that reason, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by it. You know, Jenny talked about it just a second ago as she was talking about some of those game-changing things in warfare and such. But I want to harken back a little bit for those that made it to opening ceremonies yesterday, some of the stuff that came up there. So my first thought of innovation as, you know, somewhere between like an 8 and 10-year-old was getting a computer on my desk for the first time. Mine was, as was mentioned yesterday, not a compact, but mine was a TI-99. The thing barely had any RAM in it, didn't have a hard drive, you used cassettes, tapes, but it put a computer on your desk and really made you think differently about what computers were for and what computers could do. And then it fundamentally caused a change in mindset for everyone out there in terms of how we would think about harnessing that power for warfare. And it fundamentally changed things where computers were now ubiquitous and such. Then fast forward a few years, these things came along, right? And what did that do? It also game changed everything because it put the power of the world's knowledge right in your hand. And you see combat power being harnessed from that when you see the SOF operators, the Special Operations Forces with those things kind of sitting right here so they can do some things while they run around and do their operations and such. And you look now, you know, as we see what's happening out on the Space Coast and around the world with space, and we're changing the paradigm of how space works, making it much more affordable, much easier to assure access and that sort of thing. And so again, game-changing technology that we can harness for combat advantage. And that's what I talk about when I talk about innovation. So what got me passionate about it? That's an important perspective to understand before I talk about the barriers. I came out as a young 05, not really that young, in 2010 from my last combat deployment, and the world had changed. We started getting our head up from the global war on terror, and we noticed that we had peer and near-peer adversaries out there. And that was talked a lot about yesterday during the open ceremonies, during the senior leader panels and such. But what we recognized is that we needed to accelerate our pace in order to keep up and keep ahead of those peer and near-peer adversaries. And really what it really amounts to is this notion that we need to be agile in our ability to change capability, and our ability to take capability and regenerate it and such. And if you look at kind of the recent happenings in Ukraine, you look at what's happening with the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and such, and it's been all about agility. What works today does not work tomorrow. What works tomorrow doesn't work the next day. So your ability to adapt and overcome is a big deal. And so when you think about innovation, you know, that to me is the way you get around that. And for me, I saw that new world order coming out of that tour, and then I joined the acquisition force for a while, and I had a unique set of experiences, I'll say. I went to the F-35 program for a little while and experienced what kind of generational change in capability looked like. You know, an airplane that arguably took 30 years to develop, but changed the game quite a bit, but it just took a long time to make happen. It's not very agile. Then I went and I ran a program called the Long Range Anti-Ship Missile. Some of you might be familiar with it. It was a gap-filling missile capability. It still is. But we ran that as an accelerated acquisition program where we were allowed to break all the rules as long as we weren't breaking the law in the process. And so that showed me that, yes, you could take the normal process and accelerate it, make it go a little quicker, but it was going to come at a cost. In our case, the cost was a little bit of sacrifice in performance and an expense. It was a more expensive thing. It's not very scalable. And so in my time, I then found my way down here to Orlando, to NOC TSD, familiar to most of you here at the conference and such as the Navy component here. And we're in this lab environment. I joined this community here at ITSEC, and I see all this notion of commercial technology that has been pulled in this spin out of industry and into out of commercial and into industry for government purposes. And to me, that was the way to go. You know, fundamentally, there's more R&D, there's more, you know, work in terms of research and development and innovation happening in the commercial world because that's where the funding is and such. So if you can grab that and pull it in, then that's the way to accelerate and keep that agility there. And we're seeing that play out in spades in those two conflicts that are going on right now in Ukraine and over in the Middle East. And so I think the thesis is there. And so if you buy it, you know, if you buy that thesis, what are the barriers? And I kind of bundle them into three different categories: resources, infrastructure, and culture. And we're going to talk about it that way. So what do we mean about resources? I'm not here to talk about how to fix the budget process and get more money out of the budget process and that sort of thing. There are folks that have been walking around the ITSEC floor and been up on the stage this week that might be able to do some of that, might be able to fix that process, might be able to reallocate budgets and that sort of thing. But those are big things that take, you know, big senior leaders and take a lot of time to make happen, probably congressional action to make happen here in the U.S. What are the practical things that we can do at our collective levels to affect that and kind of get around this as a barrier? I think it first starts with a two-way conversation that's led by the government as the requiring folks, the folks that understand what's the need out there. And it comes back to what I like to call communicating the hard problems. And so what are those things that if they could have fixed would move the needle in our capability, move the needle in our agility today? And can the government folks communicate that to all of us in industry, all of us in academia, so that we can break down those barriers and go do things that will move the needle and keep things agile? The next piece on that, I think, kind of then points back to what do we in industry and our academic partners do about that, and how do we do it? One piece is many of us use internal research dollars and do, you know, projects on speculation in order to kind of lead turn designs and desires to be able to build something ahead of need in some cases, get out ahead of the curve. Well, again, if we're guided by that notion of the hard problems that the government have put out there, then we can be really crisp in how we invest those dollars and do more with them. By the same token, if we're talking to each other and cooperating, collaborating, we can make those dollars go in a way that 1 + 1 can equal more than 2, and we build a bigger solution, a better solution that gets more of the problem solved up front on that. And then lastly, because I know there's a fair amount of folks here that are involved with, you know, programs like the Small Business Innovative Research Program, the SBIRs and such, and that do grant work. Those things too, in a lot of places, the research dollars that are out there can be done to do kind of, you know, neat things that don't necessarily move the needle. But again, getting crisp with those things and making sure that all those things move the needle towards one of those hard problems will really help us overcome this bit of resourcing and such. And so what I would tell you is that I think the resources piece is solvable. I think we have the capability and the power to solve that amongst ourselves to some degree. Not entirely, but to some degree. Sadly, though, even if we solve that, we still got some more things to worry about. So let's dive into infrastructure a little bit. So infrastructure, and by that I mean kind of the environment in which a problem occurs, in which a system has to live, in which a capability has to do its job and such. So think about for any aircraft, it has to have a runway of some sort. That's its environment, whether that's a conventional runway for a traditional land-based Air Force aircraft, whether it's a carrier for a naval aircraft that's carrier-based, or it could be a prepared strip, prepared pad for a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft like the U.S. Marine Corps uses. And such, thinking about kind of the three variants of F-35 there and such. That's the environment. And so again, I think it starts with an honest conversation from the government about what are those environments, what are the sticking points of those environments, what are we doing to change those environments and such, and communicating that to the problem solvers so that the problem solvers can take that into account and adapt their solutions to those environments. I think it also is a piece on the government there to say that, hey, as we're looking at infrastructure, we have to know that we're adapting that infrastructure. So what do I mean by that? Several years back, and you see it all over the place on the floor today, game engine technology became a high enough fidelity and at a low enough cost that we could apply that to flight simulation and other types of simulation that we're doing out there. The problem was a lot of those game engine simulations came out of an always connected environment where they had high bandwidth needs, and in some cases a headset that was good enough for playing a game was not good enough to allow for a flight simulation and see the kinds of things you need to see. So fundamentally the things were out there, but they weren't ready for prime time. But as a result of a two-way conversation that happened frankly here in this forum, we were able to overcome some of those things, and now you walk the floor, and most of what you see out there are those small kind of medium fidelity simulators that have a small footprint and are fairly low cost, rather than the giant 6 degrees of freedom, building size simulators. And we do it at a much lower cost, and we do it in a way that allows many more reps and sets for the operators out there to get more frequent touches on their skill set. That's a notion of that two-way conversation, and what it took. A conversation from the government to communicate the environment and the constraints of it, excuse me, and a listening session, if you will, from the problem solvers that were able to then take that solution and adapt it. Lastly, I want to talk about culture. Culture is probably both the easiest and the hardest piece of all this, because it's the easiest because we control it. We can do what we need to do for ourselves. It's the hardest because we all know what we know. We're comfortable with what we're comfortable with. And it's really hard for us to break those habits. We're human. That's the way it goes. I would tell you, and I think you probably heard more around the show this week, that the authorities, the policies, the laws are all in place that allow us to break through the barriers and do what we need to do. There's really more of that willingness to do it, willingness to take risks, willingness to be critical thinkers and mission-first thinkers that we really have to think about. And then at the same time, if you're one of those people that think that way, finding where you have advocacy and then leveraging that advocacy to get around that barrier and get around the people that will say no to a particular thing and get to the people that will give you the magical yes. The last thing I want to put out there about culture is innovation and can you force it? Maybe a little controversial in the next big thing event, but I would submit that you shouldn't try to force innovation. You can't. You can't just say that, hey, AI is here and AI is going to save the world at the end of the day. I think what you really need there is to create the environment, an environment like this, an environment like DIU and AFWorks and the Tech Grove and these places that are, seedling places to be able to take and bring new problem solvers into the equation, understand the problems and take new approaches to it in a kind of a build it and they will come sort of mindset. At the end of the day, we've got to succeed. We don't have a choice. I think you would understand right now from looking at both, what happens in the Ukraine right now and what happens in the Red Sea today and the rest of the Middle East, that what's going to happen when our adversaries perceive us as weak or depleted and they perceive they might have an advantage. I think we all agree the world is in a better place when the world order is kept and such. So at the end of the day, the way we're going to keep that way is to maintain our agility through innovation. So I look forward to getting with you and breaking down those barriers.
All right, so the first question. I often find it difficult to get people to be willing to try different approaches in problem solving. It's a combined human inertia and risk aversion problem set. What's your advice in motivating people to be willing to take more risk and move towards more innovation?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's about the why, right? I mean, I painted the picture of the why, and it's about preserving the world order and such, and kind of tying it to that. But by the same token, kind of flood with data, that if you can show the data about what the risk really is and be a critical analyzer of the risk, then you can really turn it into a different conversation. It doesn't seem such a big step to take when you analyze the risk and you understand where it is and you're showing how you mitigate that risk. And from there can then take that step. And again, like I mentioned before, there is a piece of advocacy. You can't go into someone that's famous for saying no and then expect that they're going to give you a yes. You've got to go find that person that's a little more willing to think that way.
Can you give a success story from your time in service where you saw these barriers overcome, resulting in accelerated innovation? What worked and what was a speed bump?
Yeah, so another great question. I think I'll draw on that one from my time at Long Range Anti-Ship Missile to start with. And again, it goes back to advocacy. My luck in that particular program is my advocate was the head of Navy acquisition. I worked straight for him, and so he had a lot of power to make barriers go away and stuff. And I think in that environment, we were able to really burn down and look at what the risk really was on that, the technical risk, if you will, on that particular thing, and move at a very fast pace. The barriers were still the folks that were entrenched in their do it the way I've always done it kind of mindset, and we're going to make a square peg fit in a round hole all the time. And fundamentally, the way you got around them in that case was we squashed them with authority from above. That isn't always practical. I think if you're in an environment where you've got a commander or an authority figure that can do that, that's great. If you're not, I think you have to find a way to work around it, and then that's what gets you through. And it's just sticking with it and pounding the pavement to get it done.
So how much detail from the government is too much, too little? Requirements documents drive development, but an overly complicated document guides as much as it restricts. How can we help industry with this balance?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the art of the how. I think there's absolutely a balance to that, and I would say to the greatest degree possible, specify the effect you want, the environment you have to achieve that effect in, and leave it to the experts. That isn't always practical because, like for instance, you know, when you look at carrier operations, which was where my career was and such, you have to worry about things like safety. You have to worry about things like electromagnetic spectrum interference and stuff that are hard and fast requirements. And so I think it's really where you have to put a constraint in place, put it in place, but don't put a constraint when you don't absolutely have to. I think that's really the kind of don't do it, you know, by exception kind of mindset is where I would recommend.
And a final very important question. Are you sure the title of your session isn't Why Can't Navy Beat Army? Absolutely not. Thanks, Bob.
Beat Army.
All right. Join me in thanking Tim Hill.
Thank you, guys.
So our next speaker is Chris Morales, who is a partner with Point 72 Venture. He leads defense tech investments. Prior to joining Point 72, Chris served as an associate at Goldman Sachs in their investment banking division. Chris was formerly an F-18 pilot in the U.S. Navy, where he flew combat missions in support of Operation New Dawn and Enduring Freedom. During his last 2 years on active duty, he was assigned as a flight instructor responsible for teaching aircrew the techniques, tactics, and procedures of the FA-18. So thank you, Chris.
Jenny, thank you very much. Thank you for having here. Before we actually kick off the presentation, there's one very important thing to say, that is also Go Navy. Thanks for stacking the deck with Annapolis grads. All right, should be awesome. Okay, cool. So venture capitalists have invested over $3 billion into defense tech startups just this year alone. If you add all startups that have a national security impact, that number's actually much larger. Now, this is a great thing for national security. It's substantial capital coming into our ecosystem that is able to support R&D in critical capabilities. However, I'm here to tell you that is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to venture capitalists and startups focused on national security problems. There are a handful of benefits. I'm going to highlight 4 today that we can walk through and discuss just what kind of impact these particular players and this industry can have on national security. So first up, Lawyers may have put us in there. Moving on. They're very thorough. Okay, so what do VCs do, right? So we invest in startups. Typically, that's for a minority stake. Usually, there is a round of funding, there is a syndicate of investors, and they're tied to specific milestones. So for your prototypical round, a lead VC firm is probably going to take anywhere between 10 to 20% equity in a startup. There will be multiple firms investing in that round. And as I said, they're usually tied to milestones. So usually the first round of financing is an idea and maybe a little bit of progress. After that, we have what's called product market fit, which is you've built a product, you have sold it to your initial customers, and they like it, they use it. Additional milestones might be tied to revenue achievements, let's say 5 to 10 million for subsequent rounds of financing. For deep tech companies that don't have revenue, it might be tied to technological advancements. Let's say you're building a rocket, you've tested your engine, it works, it didn't blow up, here's some money. You are building some sort of flying aircraft, manned or unmanned, it flies, it works, here's additional capital. Typically, these startups, for most early stage investors, that's most of what I do, are between 0 to 4 years old. They're growing rapidly, and we help support them through various ways. So we stack the deck in the favor of our companies. We support them and enable them to grow. We may take a board seat. We may provide hiring advice. We may provide other corporate governance advice. We may make introductions to customers or other stakeholders. We generally support them and try to make them grow faster and be more effective. Now, what are some benefits of having venture capital in the ecosystem, not only to those startups, but to the ecosystem writ large? Or start off with what I call the multiplier effect. So SVDG, the Silicon Valley Defense Group, on an annual basis publishes the NatSec 100. These are 100 companies that have critical impact to national security. They also happen to be startups. Some names that you frequently see on this list on a recurring basis include Anduril, Shield AI, and SpaceX. Now, they also publish 2 figures along with this report. How much money investors have plowed into the ecosystem, usually a very, very big number, and how much money the federal government has spent on these startups, a very, very small number relative to the first. The typical takeaway, and what is written about in certain articles around this particular phenomenon, is that federal expenditures have not caught up to investors investing in the space, and unless that happens, the space will not remain viable and investor interest will move elsewhere. That is true. That is important, but that is not the takeaway that I have here. The takeaway I have here is actually the inverse of that, which is that if you are a PM, a contracting officer, if you're managing a project, and you give $1, one taxpayer dollar to defense tech startups or to venture-backed startups more broadly, that is met with an additional $10.18 of investor interest. Now, I will say that across our portfolio, we see basically almost the exact same number when it comes to how much investors have put in versus how much revenue the companies have actually brought forth. This means that our taxpayer dollars go over 11 times farther in a venture-backed startup than they do in a non-venture-backed startup. And that is critical if you think that you have limited resources and we need to develop important capabilities technologically for our national security. Now, investors put in $10 for every $1 of government revenue. It is not irrational. It is because startups are subscribers to the lean methodology or forced efficiency. This is most specifically illustrated, most clearly illustrated in the difference between SpaceX's Starship and NASA's Space Launch System, or SLS. So Starship, fully reusable spacecraft, has done a bunch of cool tests, lots of great videos. If you haven't seen it on YouTube, I highly recommend it. It is a fully reusable spacecraft that is built to go to low Earth orbit and other destinations in the solar system. That spacecraft, the most advanced spacecraft that we have seen on this planet so far, is $100 million per launch. That is a high figure. It will go down in cost as the cost of R&D, as other fixed costs are amortized over additional launches, and as manufacturing gets to be more efficient. Contrast that with NASA's SLS, $2 billion. That is the low figure. It's actually probably closer to $4 billion, if not more, to launch one of these spacecraft. It is the main workhorse of the Artemis program that is slated to return humans to the moon, and it is dramatically over budget, chronically late, and essentially still has issues that need to be worked out. Now, why are startups so efficient when it comes to spending capital, and ultimately when it comes to scaling, it's because they essentially are default dead. They're default dead in that they're burning cash, and they need to prove they have a right to exist. That right to exist is actually the ability to deliver a product that is 10x better than the competition at or below the existing cost that it would take to solve the additional problem. In order to do that, they have to be laser focused on cost, laser focused on efficiency, and they need to preserve that margin on the additional dollar, in this segment, usually through firm fixed price contracts, to generate margin on that incremental dollar of spend of their product to pay back the investors for that initial 10x and return then some. That is how the model works. That is ultimately how you get greater capability for the national security community at a lower quantum and a lower total spend dollars for taxpayers. Next, the third benefit I'd like to highlight, which is the ecosystem multiplier. Now, if you're a government stakeholder, whether you run a particular organization, whether you're in service leadership, whether you're a PM or a PEO, you talk to one company, you explain to them their needs, you talk about your capability gaps, you complain about what you're seeing other companies doing in the ecosystem, you have talked to that one company and you have imparted your thoughts to that one company. If you engage with investors, if you engage with multiple investors at the same time, even better if you bring them in for a roundtable, you can communicate not only to those investors, but also through a much bigger ecosystem. That includes their portfolio companies, but it also includes other companies they engage with that aren't necessarily in their portfolio. Let me put some numbers around this. So in our defense tech strategy at Point 72, we have a little over a dozen companies in various stages of maturity. Some are out of stealth, some are still in stealth, but they're there. We also engage probably with about 300 to 500 companies on an annual basis, and these are opportunities to potentially engage with other folks and impart those same messages. Additionally, if you have unmet capability needs or capability gaps, you have the ability to use us essentially as a tech scout. Whether or not it's in our portfolio, we can say, hey, we saw an interesting company that solves this problem set, you should probably go talk to them. The final benefit that I want to highlight of venture capital and startups is mentorship. So this is a very Byzantine industry. It is hard sometimes to see exactly where decisions are made. It is a hard sales process to navigate. I don't need to tell you that. You're the folks in the room that have lived it. For a startup that is default dead, that is burning cash, and that only has a certain amount of time to prove that they have a right to exist, is very hard. So what we do as investors, not only in defense, but in other industries as well, is we're able to share learnings across different companies, across different sectors, and across different organizations. So this is a sample of our portfolio. In our portfolio, we have companies building autonomous systems in multiple domains, air, sea, land. We have companies that are building spacecraft. We have companies that are building software centered around AI to tackle specific defense problem sets. And we have companies that are doing a whole manner of different things. We even have a company that's building an electric flying boat. That's Regent. Go to their website. It's incredible. We're able to take learnings across these customer sets, across these sectors, of folks who have serviced different parts of the Department of Defense, the IC, partners, and allies, transcribe those learnings over the 4.5 years we've been investing in this space, and help other companies flatten the learning curve and engage effectively with the DoD and others. That helps them deliver their capabilities, that helps them solve problems, and that helps us ultimately stay more secure with greater technology capabilities. So with that, those are the key benefits that I've highlighted about venture capital, how we can work with VCs, with startups to ultimately deliver critical capabilities to national securities faster than the speed of relevance. With that, I'm happy to take your questions.
So how does a startup start their journey to seek investors? What is the entry point and any suggestions for improving their success for investment?
Absolutely. So this largely mimics what the steps you should take to just start a business more broadly. So you have an idea, you have a thesis. Let's say you have an idea that the military could use better tools to essentially process open source intel. Well, it probably behooves you to go ahead and put together a wireframe, put together a deck, put together a video, put together a very bare minimum MVP, go and show that to customers get feedback that you are actually on the right track, right? Make sure you're putting together the right team. Make sure that your skill sets are complementary. You have someone in this industry, you need someone who understands the DoD and how to navigate the space. You need a technologist that is tremendously capable and is one of the best people in their field for their particular problem set. Bring all those things together. Think the business plan through, think the product through, think the team through, have those initial proof points, and then, only then, is when you should actually start to really engage investors. And typically, some different ways that we meet companies. More often than not, it comes through our network. We have a handful of national security professionals and folks who've been in industry who have wide networks that when someone wants to work on a problem set, oftentimes it'll go through there. So if you want to talk to investors, I recommend getting a warm intro to said investor. That's always the best way to do it. Occasionally, we'll meet folks in the wild. There's at least one or two of our portfolio companies that we've met at conferences or different events that we become particularly excited about. And last but not least, this is not so helpful for the individual company, but occasionally we'll hear about somebody doing something interesting, and we'll reach out to that person and then get connected there. But no matter what you do, I promise you that if you have great technology, if you have a great team, and if you're tackling an important problem with customer feedback, that investors will absolutely be banging down your door.
So we're at a modeling and simulation conference. So for you in VC, what are the types of modeling and sim applications or capabilities that you find most interesting right now?
Absolutely. So there have been quite a few DIU solicitations for COA generation, specific through LLMs. I think that more broadly, whether it's COAs in various theaters or in the Indo-Pacific, you're going to have very complex battle problems that you're going to need to target. You're going to need all the resources you can, likely at the edge, to be able to prosecute those targets. And so some sort of planning or effectiveness when it comes to tackling complex battle sets, that's one area that we think is interesting. Another area, it's tied to modeling and simulation, but it's more around training and TTPs. As we've seen, particularly in the war in Ukraine, both sides need to adapt and iterate quickly in how they employ specific technology. Part of that's actual updates to technology, basically really quick DevOps and really quick iteration. Another part of that is TTPs and training. And so you can get all these great startups with USVs and UUVs and collaborative teaming, EW, all these problem sets, but if you don't actually know how to use it effectively and you can't change and operationalize your tactics quickly, it's going to be a very, very rough time to adapt to warfare in the 21st century. And so I think there's definitely an opportunity to sort of take the intel and the data that we're seeing on many of the hotspots around the world and then operationalizing that into training tactics and TTPs that will both allied forces as well as domestic forces can adopt to sort of stay ahead of the power curve.
Brilliant. Well, with that, join me in thanking Chris for a great session.
Go Navy.
So our next speaker.
Yeah. Gotta take advantage. Always. There you go.
Our next speaker is Charles Newton. He's the director of the AI platform at SOAR Technology, and he has over a decade of experience creating cutting-edge AI solutions for the Department of Defense. He has spearheaded groundbreaking projects in areas such as interactive training simulations, autonomous decision-making, natural language processing, and AI-driven analytics. Charles has led foundational AI-funded research projects at DARPA, the Office of Naval Research, the Air Force Research Lab, the Army Research Institute, and Army DevCom. So join me in welcoming Charles to the stage.
Thanks. So how many folks here actually trust AI? See a show of hands. I got one. Okay. Anyway, okay. Jacob does. Okay. Couple. What do we think the barriers are to trust? In my experience, a lot of it is explainability. How can you really trust something that can't really explain itself? So there's a number of elements that I'm going to go through in my experience actually deploying AI technology to the DoD. Design principles that we've taken into account when designing these systems that promote, user acceptance and ultimately transition into operational systems. And the first is actually trust. If something can explain itself, you can really start to trust it. There's a number of design elements that we've included into our systems over the past couple of decades that really relate to the inherent explainability of the system. Those design elements include, at a basic level, being able to ask the system why. Why did you make that decision? Why did you reach that conclusion? And then there's a number of elements that kind of exist in the background of that. Can it read a source? Can it draw a conclusion from a source? Can it read a document and draw a conclusion like a person would read a document? Right? As a person, you can go through and you're going to go open a web browser, right? You're going to go use information sources and you're going to follow a process to reach an answer. And AI algorithms should really be designed the same way, where they're following a step-by-step process and really coming up with that traceability element. Another barrier of entry that we've run into is just the sheer rapid nature of innovation in this space. So I don't know about you, but 5 years ago when a customer asked me what it took to get AI onto their system, I had a completely different answer. The costs have changed, the power requirements have changed, the cooling has changed, literally everything's changed. And I imagine in 5 years, we're going to run into the same issue. And the DoD acquisition cycle, really isn't set up to, be amenable to that, right? People want requirements today that are going to be the same case in 5 years, and we're kind of living in a world where that just isn't the case at all. So, as you think about, how you're going to acquire AI into your organization, think about the future, right? Think about how you can kind of design these systems so that you can plug in the latest technology so that things don't get stale. Maybe that's having modular systems where you can upgrade the CPU. Maybe that's planning in advance for obsolescence, right? That's understanding that there's a depreciation curve associated with these systems. These systems age, right? They no longer become state of the art, and you can plan that in advance, right? So maybe there's a 3-year depreciation curve you kind of build into these models. The other aspect of these systems that is extremely important is the usability of these systems. The first time I saw people using ChatGPT, there was this almost like black box reaction that a lot of people had. You open up the website, and what is it? It's a text box, and there's nothing in it. It's kind of that proverbial like Microsoft Word blank page reaction. What do I do with it? Maybe I can ask it a question? I don't know. Very confusing. So in a lot of our systems, we've designed kind of like small tutorials. Maybe it's a YouTube style presentation. Maybe it's a little animation that when you visit the page, you kind of get a sense of how to use the system. And that really plays into a design aspect around organizations and their culture, right? How are organizations going to adopt AI? I think we're all in the situation where we're all going to see kind of the transformational impact of AI in your organization. In fact, you may be personally thinking about like, how is my job going to change in 5 years? Am I still going to have a job? I don't know. Things are changing really quickly. What's going to change? So from a usability aspect, if you can go to the slide, yeah. From a usability aspect, a lot of processes that we've designed have kind of in the DoD have kind of been like this, right? You kind of get this 1920s manufacturing kind of like, yeah, okay, I'm going to follow the step-by-step process, right? Everyone's seen the DoD acquisition cycle, like crazy slide, right? And AI is kind of going to allow us as organizations to move into more of an explorer mindset here. So as you incorporate AI, just think about all the ways you've used ChatGPT in your personal life and kind of like all the little breadcrumbs that piece of software has about you, about what you've been thinking, about what you've been doing. So can you have software that kind of like, as you use it organically, has AI in the background, understands the problems, understands your processes, and kind of allows you to operate much more organically in your organization. So another aspect that we run into all the time is actually security. So how many folks have actually gone through an ATO process with AI? Raise your hand. A couple folks. That just adds an extreme wild card into your organizational risk, right? Getting ATO applied to AI or a large language model has really become a black box. From an information security standpoint, what is a large language model, right? It's something that takes and it aggregates information. So when you start thinking about like classification by compilation, right? Do we need safeguards into these systems so that when they access too much CUI data, right, they kind of hit that barrier and it becomes maybe a classified system? How do we don't have any metrics over when that kind of like occurs. So you really need test cases that allow folks on the the security side to understand the security implications of your system and really understand, what's the classification level of this? Like, how do I know as it collects information over time, how is that going to actually feed into how I treat the security of my system? Another aspect of security is definitely like the legal aspects of things, right? A lot of these models come from unclear training data. How is the training data sourced? Are there things in that training data that we understand? I don't know. So a solution to that would be training these models from scratch. When, in my experience, a lot of organizations don't have that capability. There's maybe like 5 to 10 organizations that are training these models from scratch. The rest of us are really kind of consuming these models. So from that like supply chain perspective, right, we almost need to come up with a legibility of the supply chain, right? Where is the information coming from? How is this information being used? And in a way that allows the organizations that are putting together these models to still keep their privacy around their data, still keep their intellectual property secure. Another aspect that we run into all the time is related to training. So folks, when they take in AI, will often use it suboptimally, right? They'll ask it one question, they'll ask it 2 questions. It's kind of helping them a little bit. Other users become power users immediately, right? You may have seen your kids immediately open up ChatGPT, and that's their new Google, that's their new school. They're just going to use it for everything, right? So we kind of have this learning curve, and we really need capabilities that allow folks that maybe aren't necessarily familiar with these systems to take and adopt it and use it effectively in their personal life. Another aspect of training is, especially as we get into kind of this AI acceleration curve that we're in right now, will be it starts impacting the sort of work you end up doing, right? So if you imagine AI is doing all the easy work, right? It's kind of that junior level employee. Well, what's left for you as the human, also doing your job? It's going to be a series of very difficult tasks trying to accomplish things. So if you think about burnout, et cetera, you can imagine folks maybe in the medical field that are used to working 36-hour shifts, and their decision making is fatigued at the end. Maybe you're 33 hours into a 36-hour shift at the ER, right? You're not making decisions as clearly as you were at the beginning of your shift. So from that perspective, we really need to start thinking about what happens when every decision you make is hard because AI couldn't solve it. So that becomes an extremely important barrier, is how is this going to impact your employees as you adopt this technology? Another aspect of AI is, especially in the DoD, is the ethics that surround it. And in a lot of cases, we now have, in 2024, we have some ethical frameworks in place, but really it's difficult to attach these to tangible aspects of systems. So it's kind of hard to connect the dots there. So, in practice, I think this will work itself out over time, but, again, something to consider. And then lastly, there's a huge advantage to having access to your own data. In fact, that may be the most important takeaway from AI over the past couple of decades, which is organizations that have done their homework in keeping their data and actively collecting their data are going to have a huge advantage utilizing that data on their day-to-day basis when using AI. So we really need to start thinking about that now, right? If you've got hard drives in your organization that are heading out the door, if you've got maybe mission recordings that are heading out the door, and those hard drives get erased or they never get collected, right? That's valuable data, and it's maybe won't be affecting you in 2024, but 10 years from now, there may be a person in your position that really wishes they had that data because they have excellent AI that could exploit it, and they're going to be in a much better position if they have access to that information. So with that, there's our 7 or so principles that I've kind of applied over the past decade or so, deploying AI into operational systems, and I think we can turn it over to questions.
Brilliant. So teams offering AI run the great risk of overpromising and under-delivering. That risk and experience leads to government hesitancy. How does industry balance honest promises and delivery to ally these concerns?
Well, the best thing you can do is test your system out, right? Think about how the user is going to operationally utilize that technology and build that into your life cycle. So can you come up with test and evaluation plans that actually map to how the user is going to end up, or the operational use case is actually going to end up utilizing that technology? Make sure it meets those needs. Another aspect you can do is iterative development, right? Can you put in early prototypes in front of representations of your end users and get them talking to you early, incorporate that feedback into your actual product development cycle, and then kind of avoid this industry showing up with a surprise at the end of an acquisition cycle, and it doesn't necessarily meet the end user needs.
Is there any advice you have for the industry folks in this room when they're thinking about how to integrate AI into their workflows, what that first step should look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the easiest way to incorporate AI into your organization is to think through how your organization operates now. So do you have a step-by-step or a mental model over kind of what's going on? You can kind of think about an organization as maybe a series of transactions or a map or a graph. And start thinking about where would be the biggest value add. So you can incorporate value in a couple of different ways. It could just be cost, right? That's an easy one. This task takes 40 hours right now. Maybe it could take 20 hours if I incorporated AI. But there's also a number of other advantages, which is AI can give you some additional situational awareness over what's happening, right? Are there calendar invites that you're missing or folks that aren't being added to that could be added as a suggestion? There's other elements too related to what do you do with folks if you make them more productive, right? So we kind of think about maybe AI reducing jobs, but also like how can you unlock the human capital associated with your organization by making everybody much more productive and giving them extra time to contribute back to your organization in other ways.
All right, well with that, please join me in thanking our speaker. Okay, so Tyler is here. He's at the registration desk, and they are moving very slow to register him. So we're having him blow off registration and come straight here. So if you don't mind giving him a minute, he should be here any moment. Bob is going to get him. But while we're waiting for him, I will introduce Tyler, and then he can just come in and start speaking. So Tyler Sweat, he's the CEO of Second Front System, where he works to drive technology adoption in DoD by streaming the ATO process. So I can't think of a better speaker to follow the last one because we can deep dive the ATO process in a little bit more depth. He's also a technical advisor at Palace Advisors, a partner at the nonprofit Silicon Valley Defense Group. Previously, Tyler served as the head of national security at Calypso AI and founded and sold a technology advisory firm, Future Tense. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he is a former U.S. Army officer. So we're just going to hang out here for a couple minutes, and then Tyler will walk in, and we will get started. So thank you for your patience. You could theoretically try to grab a drink at the bar while we wait. I'm not a good dancer. I mean, I can try to throw out some moves. Pardon? Oh, you've got another question. All right, well, let's see if it's in this. All right, hold on. Oh, Tyler's here. Oh, great. Yeah. All right. Okay. All right, Tyler, I've already introduced you.
Awesome.
So you can just jump on stage.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. Yeah, why don't he take this?
I can just do this or stand right here. Yeah. Sorry for coming flying in and being late. I think I thought 5 hours of lead time for a flight from Dulles to here would be enough, and it was absolutely not. So here we are. Good to see everybody. I'm Tyler. Work at a company called Second Front Systems. We think about sort of the problem we get after at a more macro, right? Like how many folks have had an awesome experience getting their car inspected? How many people are like, you know what, that rocks. I wish that happened every time I cross the state line, every time I cross the county line, every time I cross a township or a parish line. I wish I had to pull in, go through another one of them, and see what was wrong this time. Hey, I've got a cracked manifold. Hey, my tire's overinflated. Hey, my mirror's wrong. Right? In that scenario, the incentives, unintentionally in most cases, are on that inspector to find a deficiency, because when they think about the job, they're trying to increase security, increase compliance. How do you know you did that? Can't really prove a negative, right? Used to make the joke, hey, my pen protects me from tigers. People would be like, well, that's not true. I was like, I don't know. I've never been attacked by a tiger. Use that same mindset, now apply that to software in the US government. How do we think about deploying and consuming software? Right? We've got some macro policies that sit up at the top. And then as you start to federate down into departments, into agencies, into different teams, everyone's got a little bit of a local policy exemption. Everything's just a little bit different. What is the result? The result is I'm going through just about the same process over and over and over and over, which puts time, money, and resources in between capability and a warfighter. What it does not do, despite the best intentions, is increase security. What it does not do is increase lethality. What it absolutely does not do is increase time to value, time to mission, time to impact. So where we sit is in between that commercial software capability and global sort of national security end users. I use national security broad. We work with critical infrastructure. We work with partners and allies, Ministry of Defense and NATO and sort of everything in between. Our vision is, hey, why don't we bring the best of software to bear on how we start to look at automation, how we start to look at reciprocity, how we start to look at transferability, so that as you progress through a security and release pipeline, you build the security artifacts, you build the body of evidence, you can build customization in so that each of those local policy exemptions are able to toggle and say, hey, you know what, for my report, I need paragraph E4D. And then over here, hey, for my report, I actually need a yellow form, or I need a TPS report cover sheet. You can sort of do it however you want without having to rerun a process that is taking months and more often than not years, costing millions of dollars. If we think about the defense budget, if we think about how we prosecute conflict and what the geopolitical future looks like, spending $1 million a pop on redundant compliance feels like not the best use of capital. That's capital not going to capability. That's capital not going to soldiers. It's not going to welfare. It's not going to the team. It's sort of getting lost in this like really weird market inefficiency. So we're trying to standardize that, bring that to bear. The other side of that is we spend a bunch of time advocating on the Hill to bring some consistency into how the department procures software. And so I'm going to use procure not in a, you know, hey, DOD 5000, JSIDs and JORAB, they're all screwed up. Everybody yells about that. I get it. I actually think we have all the authorities we need. I think we need to look at buying software as a national security enterprise the same way the venture community approached like a YC safe. If you've seen like the Y Combinator safe note, where they brought structured terms and conditions in that were accepted cross industry. So everyone sort of knew what they were getting into. Hey, I'm going to use a YC safe. Cool, got it. Understand what's in the note, understand what the left and right limits are. That allows organizations to then start to mold their business models, adapt, and innovate. Because what the other part of what we're missing, we talked about the inefficiency of compliance, sort of just doing that over and over. If I've got that as an x-axis, and as a y-axis, I've got a slightly different way we're buying every single time, there are no market forces. There is no competition. You're losing all of the greatness of like a free and open market. All of that, how we're getting improvement, how the best product's going to win, all that's out the door. It's who can sort of survive long enough and kind of adapt just enough to the mission. That's what we end up getting. So if we can start to bring a modicum of consistency in how we think about data rights, how we think about derivative works when we're talking about models and access to data and things like that, and a little bit of IP, we could start to bring some consistency in how we deploy and consume software. All of the stuff we see in the media about how there's tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of private capital, folks like Chris coming into the market, helping to subsidize just tier one R&D, we don't lose it. So my fear is if we don't fix that X and the Y axis, we're never going to hit the equilibrium. We're going to have squandered one of the greatest opportunities to underwrite a generational investment in defense R&D. And we're going to be right where we were when we sort of sunsetted JIDO and lost all the lessons we learned during the war on terror with IEDs. So I have no idea where I am on time. That's my rant. That's all I got.
All right, cool.
Is that cool?
All right. So if I'm a software developer in industry and I'm trying to figure out how to navigate the ATO process, where do I start, and what should I be thinking about?
Yeah. So I mean, first, much like when we talk about DoD, DoD is not a single buyer, right? DoD is like 800 one-pound gorillas that think they're all 800-pound gorillas. An ATO is not an ATO is not an ATO. So when somebody asks, hey, I'm thinking about deploying into a regulated environment, I'm thinking about deploying into classified, you're trying to reduce as many dependencies as possible. I just use a walled garden example. Hey, you want to get your box into a walled garden. What does that mean? Hey, it can't be dependent on something outside the walled garden in order to survive. And it has to function. The box has to stay a box. We can't get all Schrodinger with it. We're like, we don't know until we turn it on. Like, it's got to work inside the garden. If it can work inside the garden, like, you can sort of figure the rest out.
Is there a plan to streamline software accreditation for Department of Energy platforms?
I'm sure there is. I don't have one. We're looking at FedCiv and StateRAMP and FedRAMP and all of that. I think for us, it is less about looking at like a specific subset of a compliance regime or a data classification, and more thinking about, hey, the mission and some advocacy, because as soon as we can get a deployment in, we can start to run. We're doing it in some of the highest national mission networks right now, so we could. But it sort of takes two to tango in that, and we just haven't. I don't know anybody at DOE, so not yet.
And if I'm in industry and I want to figure out how to work with your organization, where do I start?
Yeah, we got a snazzy new website that our team is super proud of, so check that out. Secondfront.com. Hit me on LinkedIn. Shoot me a LinkedIn note or grab my cell phone. Happy to connect. I'll tell everybody, like, first thing we're going to run everybody through is a big technical assessment. We want to confirm the thing can do what you say it does. We want to confirm the thing can work in the walled garden. We're not in the business of just sort of signing up things and not getting them deployed. So it's a cool process. Along the way, whether it's a fit or not, we're going to tell you everything we know about deploying into the environments. So it's free learning, free technical architecture advice if you want it.
And a shameless plug for Tyler and his team. You should definitely check out his podcast, All Quiet on the Second Front. It's very good, and there's lots of acquisition tips and other cool companies that Tyler features. And with that, join me in thanking Tyler.
Thanks for waiting around, everybody. Sorry.
And so we're going to exit this room so that they can set it up, and then there will be a party in here at 5:45 with free drinks and everything. Make sure you have a little card ticket, because that's your entry to drink for free. All right, brilliant. Thanks, guys.